This video was sponsored by Skillshare. The first 1,000 people who click the link in my description can claim a 1-month free trial to Skillshare Premium. Hello, light slingers and layabouts. My name is TBSkyn, and, well, the Ruination event didn't go so well, did it? From what I've heard through the grapevine, Riot certainly didn't anticipate the level of backlash and negativity it got, although how exactly they will react to that feedback going forward remains to be seen. Riot hasn't publicly responded to the criticism or posted any kind of post-mortem analysis themselves, letting us know what their takeaway is, so we can only guess. Originally, I wanted to create a video going over all of the major criticisms and complaints, but the more I investigated them, the more I realized that, first of all, that video would be 6 hours long, but also that a lot of them can be traced back to what I think are a few common causes. So, that's what we're going to discuss in this video. The Sentinels of Light event, what was it, why did it happen this way, and how did it go wrong? Before we get into it though, please understand that this video is based on my own perspective and opinions, and informed by publicly available information as well as whatever I happened to hear through the grapevine while I was looking into the event. I don't have special insider information on Riot Games, nor do I have inside information on the Sentinels of Light event and its development. This is one perspective from one person from the outside who is doing his best to build an informed critique, so keep a critical distance. Anyway, with that caveat out of the way, to understand the rise of the Sentinels event, you first have to understand all the things that lead up to it, and it begins, somewhat appropriately, with Senna and Lucian. Once upon a time, in September of 2013, Lucian the Purifier was released into League of Legends. He was the game's first black male character, he had an exciting new play pattern, and a fascinating lore connection with a champion who had been released earlier the same year. Lucian, you see, once had a wife, his partner and equal, and together they were Sentinels of Light, battling the scourge of the undead across Runeterra. But, in a cruel twist of fate, Thresh the Chain Warden, a now formerly terrifying skull-faced wraith of torture and torment, manipulated and ambushed them, tearing Senna's soul from her body and leaving Lucian to pick up her gun and pursue the spectre with a single-minded desire for revenge. Senna, thus, was a textbook example of a fridged girlfriend. This is an old trope in storytelling that describes characters who exist primarily to be wronged, killed, hurt, or brutalized to motivate someone else's actions. Think the parents of an RPG protagonist who are killed by the Demon Lord to get the hero to go on their journey, or, as is often the case, a wife, girlfriend, or general love interest whose suffering exists to motivate a male character towards vengeance or a rescue quest or whatever. Senna had no character beyond her role as a damsel in distress for Lucian to chase around. She was a frightened face in a lantern and had no stories, no lore, really no voice lines, no interactions, no nothing. She was a character in name only. She was basically a prop. And that kind of sucked, frankly, because no work was done to make Senna a real character. Lucian's characterization suffered as well. What was the nature of this transcendent relationship that was worth turning his entire life into an obsession with vengeance? What was Senna like that Lucian loved her so deeply? Besides the general hackiness of using a dead woman to motivate a badass Avenger man, it was a giant hole in the story that Riot, in typical Riot fashion, spent 6 years entirely failing to do anything about. By 2019 then, Riot has an idea. What if we brought Senna back and made her a champion alongside Lucian? It was a bit of an experiment from Riot's side, a means to both address the criticisms of the story and to drive the lore forwards. In part, Senna was also a test to see how players would respond to a new champion being drawn from the lore and backstory of another champion, rather than being entirely new with their own new story. The experiment, as it turns out, was a rousing success. Players responded very positively to Senna, the lore nerds were overjoyed, and all was well. Riot would go on to release Yone, Yasuo's long-dead brother as well, pulling essentially the same trick of bringing a character back from the dead for the lore connection. But Riot had bigger plans as well. Senna's backstory also began laying the first teasers for the emergence of an even bigger deep lore story character, the Ruined King. Now, the Ruined King has been spooking about the deep lore of League of Legends for a good long while, most notably as the namesake of an in-game item, and while he has been retconned back and forth a bit over the years, he was always a major player in the Shadow Isles, the source of its ruination, and the reason for the Harrowings, a yearly Halloween event where the lore describes the black mist rolling forth from the Shadow Isles to haunt the living. The Ruined King was, as the name implied, an ancient king who caused the downfall of the Blessed Isles into the Shadow Isles. I think he first appears as a character proper in Maokai's lore, where the story used to describe him as the king of the Blessed Isles who orders his sorcerers to tear down the barrier between life and death for reasons I'm not sure were ever fully explained. There was also an assumption for a long time that the voices of the altars on the Twisted Tree line, and RIP to that game mode, were those of the Ruined King and his queen forever bound to the Shadow Isles by the Ruination. It certainly fits that the male voice there is imperious and hungry for conquest, while the female voice begs for rest and an end to the Isles' corruption. They read like prototypes of Viego and Isolde, basically.
For the glory of the Shadow Isles. Sometimes I can almost remember her face.
Please end my torment. You must destroy us, all of us. I still remember. Only fragments, but I remember.
There have been fan concepts for the Ruined King as a champion floating around for years, but for a long time he was little more than background flavor in Runeterra, a historical footnote explaining the Shadow Isles, but not much of a character in and of himself. Enter Yorick Mori, specifically his 2016 rework. His new story, as a monk who survives the Ruination and uses his gift of speaking to the dead to raise an undead army against the Ruined King, is also the first time the king is spoken of as an outsider, someone who comes to the Blessed Isles looking for a way to revive his dead wife, and who sets off a magical cataclysm in doing so. Back then, I believe the idea was that the king somehow set off a chain reaction in a vault of powerful magical artifacts, and that's what caused the Ruination. That story would later be simplified into Viego's soul-stealing sword f***ing up the waters of life when Isolde's revived wraith stabs him through the chest with it. At this point, though, the king remains a background character, a piece of world building, but the elements that will come to define Viego have been laid down, and with a few minor retcons and Senna's release in 2019, they are finally solidified into what will eventually become the champion himself. As I said, Senna was in part an experiment to test the waters for lore-connected characters like Yone and Viego, and if she had been widely unpopular, maybe things would have progressed differently, but it's clear that the plans for some sort of story event featuring the Ruined King were in place since before the 10th anniversary celebration. The groundwork for who and what Viego would become, what his plot would be, were being worked out and put in place since at least Yorick's update in 2016, and the Sentinels of Light event, or some prototype version of it, was probably one of the big event ideas floating around Riot for a good long while before the actual thing was put into production in 2020. Speaking of events, though, much like Yone is a champion whose release was influenced by the success of Senna, so was the format and style of the Sentinels of Light event influenced by the success of another previous experiment, Spirit Blossom. So, a bit of behind-the-scenes history here. People internally at Riot have been championing the visual novel format for years, especially Jared Rosen, the lead writer behind Fiddlesticks and one of the writers of the Dream Daddy visual novel, has been public about wanting to do a League of Legends visual novel for a long time. But he's hardly the only one, and internally at Riot, I know that there have been years of experiments and pitches to make something like Spirit Blossom happen. These pitches never came to anything in terms of product for reasons I can only guess at, although my guess would be that it's probably the good old core gamers don't like casual games mindset flourishing with the leadership and executives at the company. By the time of Spirit Blossom, though, the visual novel faction at Riot manages to get their project off the ground, finally, in an experimental story mode to support a big skin-based event. It was called Spirit Bonds, and it took the form of a number of interactions with the titular Spirit Blossom skin characters, playing out as a visual novel-style bit of storytelling, where the story and motivations of the characters are progressively revealed more and more as you gather favor with them by completing their associated in-game missions. The event was generally generally very well received and generally very well written, and it's probably one of the horniest things that Riot has done in a very long time, and so the visual novel people at Riot had evidence and data to back up their assertion that visual novels are a good way to deliver narrative to players. Now, Spirit Bonds worked well because it took advantage of the visual novel format. Visual novels, broadly speaking, are very good at things like conversation-based relationship building, character interaction, and allowing you to get emotionally immersed in a personal dynamic. Spirit Bonds, being a series of relationships that you can choose to cultivate to whatever extent you want, was a great fit for this format. Players were motivated to play games and complete missions in order to deepen the relationship with the characters they were most interested in, but weren't forced to spend time doing missions for Teemo if what they really wanted was to get crushed in the loving coils of Snake Mommy Cassiopeia. There was a freedom of choice to explore the parts of the story that you cared about that made the event relatively freeform and rewarded you in a proportional way to the amount of time that you invested in it. Now, visual novels can do a lot more than what Spirit Bonds did. With enough time, resources, and effort, a visual novel can tell pretty much any story in any genre, but, in my opinion, Spirit Bonds is the sort of thing that the visual novel is naturally good at. Just like the format of the RTS is naturally good at telling war stories, but maybe it's a slightly more awkward fit for a romance. Spirit Bonds demonstrated to Riot's leadership that the visual novel is a valid format for delivering narrative. It demonstrated that the visual novel format can be used to encourage players to engage with the main game in order to unlock more story. And it demonstrated that it could generate player engagement with skin products, which is good for marketing. Thus, the stage is set for the Sentinels of Light event to get all of this rather wrong. But before we lay into it, we do need to recognize that Riot Games is an enormous games corporation. They employ thousands of people across multiple continents. Their games have over 100 million monthly players, and they rake in billions upon billions of dollars in profit. They have more money than God, and while in a creative field like video games, money doesn't guarantee good products, it sure as helps. And one excuse that I will never, ever, not even once, accept from Riot is that they don't have the resources to get something done. They have often said, for example, that they don't have the manpower or the internal teams to handle certain problems. They've made the excuse that one reason why they are so embarrassingly behind on visual updates that bargain bin PS2 game-looking clunkers like Cillian, Teemo, Tryndamere, Amumu, Anivia, Veigar, Blitzcrank, Malphite, Corki, Shaco, Udyr, Nidalee, Gragas, Kennen, Malzahar, Olaf, Kog'Maw, Vladimir, Xin Zhao, Misfortune, Caitlyn, Nocturne, Jarvan, Lee Sin, and Rumble are still in the game, is that it's hard to hire qualified designers and artists to handle that work. Which is true. It is hard to hire qualified designers. It's hard to build up fully staffed teams of people to take on those kinds of development challenges. It's hard to build those competences. But Riot has had 10 years to do it, and they surf on an infinite tidal wave of money. So if in the year of our Lord, 2021 current year argument, they haven't managed to build up the staff and competence needed to maintain their own flagship game's quality, that is a massive failure of management to run the company properly, and they should be criticized for that. And of course, just as I'm putting the finishing touches on this video, Riot publishes a roadmap where they announce that finally, after 10 years, they have inaugurated an internal team whose job it is to do purely visual updates on old, outdated champions. This, presumably, is the source of that updated Caitlyn model people have spotted in a Teamfight Tactics trailer. So yeah, this is good. Riot's management should still be criticized for taking this frickin' long to get this going. This should have been an ongoing process since, well, ideally since day one, but at least since like season 3 or 4. But nonetheless, good on you for finally getting it going. I'm hoping that these will come out at like a decent pace because there's a lot of work to catch up on, as I've just demonstrated, but on the other hand, these might seriously undercut the audience from my building a better video, so actually don't do this, Riot. Cancel the whole thing. I need the views. I bring this up because on the list of excuses that a corporation might give for putting out a substandard product, a global pandemic that shuts down commercial activity on all 7 continents and kills, at the time of writing, 4.5 million people is a pretty good excuse. COVID f***ed everything up for everyone, and it certainly f***ed up Riot's plans for the Ruined King season. COVID, combined with the massive 2021 Texas power grid failure crippling their partner studio Airship Syndicate, completely kneecapped the development of the Ruined King game that was supposed to act as a prelude to the event proper. On top of that, the challenges of adjusting to remote work, plus the general massive disruptions to the workforce trying to adjust to lockdowns, infections, and death, all of this makes pulling off an event like the Sentinels of Light in the time frame that they had set a really, really hard job. Game development is difficult at the best of times, and COVID is the worst of times. So I want to make sure that nobody comes away from this video with the impression that developers at Riot are lazy or stupid or bad at their jobs, or that the Sentinels of Light event went wrong because they didn't put in enough hard work to make it good. I promise you that the developers at Riot put in more work than they were actually paid to do. I promise you they did overtime and they answered emails on the weekend. They worked very hard under very difficult circumstances. But COVID isn't a carte blanche for Riot to just wash their hands and say, oh, it's not our fault, cut us some slack, there was a pandemic, because Riot Games is a staggeringly successful games company backed by one of the wealthiest mega corporations on the planet, and they had options to ameliorate this outcome. The Ruined King game was already being delayed. They could have delayed the Sentinels of Light to go along with it. They could have said, hey, there's a global pandemic. We can't make this product at the highest quality right now. Let's do what every other game company is doing and announce a delay. Now, again, that's not a simple thing to do. They have merchandising partners and sponsors and events and tie-ins and months of event planning that gets f***ed up by a delay of something that big. It throws a huge wrench in the works of a lot of things that they're planning. But if any company on the planet can afford to make a move like that, surely it is Riot Games backed by Tencent. If any company is in the privileged position to take a financial hit to ensure artistic quality, surely it is the 100 million monthly players, $1.5 billion of annual revenue mega success Riot Games backed by Tencent. What is the point of being so successful, so rich, so at the top of the industry, if you cannot take extraordinary measures to deal with extraordinary circumstances? The Sentinels of Light event has bad creative decisions. There is, in my opinion, bad writing in there, there's bad art in there, there's bad craft in there, and I'm more than happy to say so. But the argument I want to make in this video is that those bad creative decisions, they don't happen just because an individual or team of developers screw up. There are systemic and structural reasons why things go wrong the way the Sentinels of Light event went wrong, and those systemic and structural failures are first and foremost the responsibility of management, of the executives and leaders whose job it is to ensure that their workers have the best possible conditions in which to do good work. So we're not going to nitpick the writing of every chapter of the visual novel here. We're not going to list the plot holes or bad writing decisions. I'm going to try to zoom out a little bit and try to look at a bigger picture and give the best analysis that I can of why things happened the way they did, why these creative decisions were taken. And maybe I'll complain a little bit about what they did to Miss Fortune, because the Bilgewater chapter was bullshit! As we discussed, the decision to make the Sentinels of Light a visual novel was brought about, at least in part, by the success of Spirit Blossom and Spirit Bonds. It proved a workable and popular way to deliver narrative and keep players engaged playing the game, and so, from the perspective of Riot's management when planning this event, it must have seemed a relatively solid fit for the purpose. I have to imagine also that the people internally at Riot agitating for the visual novel as a format must have jumped at the opportunity to use it to tell a bigger and more, air quotes, important canon story in the lore, an opportunity to prove once and for all what a visual novel can do as a narrative medium for League of Legends. And on the face of it, there's no reason why it couldn't have worked. In fact, it did work in Wild Rift. Now, we'll come back to Wild Rift a little bit later, but they too adopted a visual novel format to give the players a chance to interact with the champions as part of the Sentinels of Light story, just at a much smaller scope. In Wild Rift, the visual novel interactions take the form of something more akin to Spirit Blossom, a series of interactions and conversations with the individual champions focused on telling a character-based story. It does a really good job, I think, of bringing you into their thinking, their emotional states, and it shows a progression of a relationship between them and the player character Rookie, avoiding many of the tone problems that plague the PC version of the visual novel. On Wild Rift, the visual novel implementation is pretty damn solid, in my opinion, and shows exactly how it can be used to characterize and deepen the story of a character through interaction and communication. While simple, it takes advantage of the strength of the format, and it is overall rather well written, in my opinion. On PC, on the other hand, things did not work out so well. The story there is much more ambitious, but it clashes catastrophically with the limitations of its format, but especially its budget. The narrative is broken up into chapters, with an attempt to structure it as a heist or treasure hunt kind of story, with the Sentinels racing Viego to find the fetters of Isolde's soul. Unfortunately, the way it plays out in practice is a disjointed, repetitive, structural mess, with a tone that oscillates wildly from lighthearted haha Scooby-Doo comedy adventures featuring Rookie and the gang to apocalyptic world-ending tragedy with hundreds of casualties and the hearts of nations corrupted by undeath. It becomes tediously repetitive, with every chapter playing out almost exactly the same. The Sentinels arrive somewhere, they get put in peril by 2 or 3 things, they fail to recover a fetter, and then they return home with a new Sentinel recruit whose primary purpose is to give you more missions to play on Summoner's Rift. And that right there is the first key issue with the visual novel. We've discussed before how one of Riot's major metrics for the success of their products is measured in engagement. This is why they made the decision to deprioritize monster champions, for example. They found in their internal statistics that those champions get less dedicated playtime than attractive humans, and so, in order to make the line go up on their data graphs, they decided to focus on cute girls and hot dudes with their shirts off, which I have complained about extensively in other videos. But that philosophy extends deeper into the game than just skins and champion design, because engagement is the bread and butter of service games like League of Legends. Contrary to some popular belief, Riot doesn't really need you to buy every single skin and every single event pass. They don't need you to drop money on every single thing they put out. What they need is for you to be engaged with their ecosystem, checking back regularly, logging in every once in a while, so that in 2 months or 6 months or a year or whatever, when they do put out a product that you would want to buy, you are still around for them to advertise to. So long as you are engaged with League of Legends as a product, you are a potential source of revenue. So long as you are engaged, you can be persuaded to click on news articles, follow influencers on social media, subscribe to YouTubers like me, all of which will remind you to care about League of Legends on some level, to think about it, and then, when a product comes out that you might want to buy, you are available to be tempted by it. What kills a game as a service is disengagement. It's people logging out and never logging back in and not caring when something new comes to the season pass. This is how Anthem died, this is how Battleborn was strangled by Overwatch, and it is the fate that League of Legends has very successfully managed to avoid for over a decade. The reason why game modes like Nexus Blitz, Black Market Brawlers, Ascension, and the rest of it keep getting removed from the game is that while those are high-quality fun modes that people enjoy playing, they don't generate the same level of just one more game addictive engagement as Summoner's Rift or Earth or ARAM. People play those modes, but they don't come back for them. In fact, they seem to be satisfied by playing them enough that they don't even play more League of Legends afterwards. Now, if you're thinking like a normal person, the idea that a player might play something, be satisfied with it, and then not immediately play more is like, good? That's like a normal thing. Oh, hey, you were satisfied with the product, so you didn't immediately need to go back for more. That seems like a good thing, but if you're running a game as a service, that's a problem. A problem that needs to be solved. So, let's take a look at the Sentinels of Light visual novel and see how it's structured, shall we? The narrative is split into chapters based on regions, which unlock on a weekly basis. Each chapter, in turn, is split into minor story beats which must be unlocked one after another by earning points from playing missions. So if you want to experience the Sentinels of Light story, you have to grind and play games in order to unlock each cutscene in a region, and you have to keep grinding and keep playing games regularly for a period of at least 4 weeks in order to unlock everything. To motivate you to keep playing, you are given an escalating number of missions by the champions you recruit, giving you achievable goals to work towards. Sure, you're tired and maybe you're not that interested in playing another match, but you got 6 takedowns for Riven that match and you almost unlocked the next story scene. Just one more game. And oops, you stole a bunch of jungle monsters in that game, so now Graves is giving you a bunch of points to encourage you. Just one more game. It's nothing revolutionary, but it is tried and true Skinner box serotonin drip feed tactics. So the structure of the visual novel is not based on what makes sense for a visual novel. It's not structured around the needs of the narrative or even good storytelling. It's structured to make you grind. It's using the promise of more story as a carrot on a stick to entice you to keep playing. Anyway, changing gears for a second, there's a mobile game called Harry Potter Hogwarts Mystery, which is aimed squarely at children and absolutely loaded with typical microtransactions. Like most microtransaction-hungry mobile games, the game starts off by feeding you lots and lots of resources and energy to get you going, to get you invested, and then, eventually, the resources dry up and it prompts you to spend real-world money to keep playing. In the case of Hogwarts Mystery, though, the game is engineered in such a way that the first time you run out of free energy, which you need to keep playing, your avatar, a child, is going to be in the grips of a strangling plant slowly getting choked to death, with their only hope of rescue being you spending money on energy points so they can free themselves. This made headlines because in a game aimed at children, putting the player character in mortal danger and then telling a child that they have to pay to save them is a monstrously cynical move. It was naked manipulation, using peril in the story to entice children to spend money in order to resolve the narrative tension. Anyway, in Sentinels of Light, the story is structured such that when the narrative cuts out to ask you to play more games to unlock the next chapter, it very often happens on some sort of cliffhanger, either because the Sentinels are in danger, being attacked by wraiths, fighting a boss, or escaping a collapsing building, or at a moment of tension just before something important is going to be revealed. Now, it's nowhere as predatory or blatant as the Harry Potter example I gave you, of course, but the technique is the same. Use dramatic tension in the story to motivate the player to engage in your desired behavior. In case of the Sentinels of Light, that behavior is grind more games. And one of the consequences of that is that the visual novel becomes stuck in a frustrating pattern. Each region needs to be broken up into a number of scenes that must be unlocked, and so the narrative of the visual novel has to conform to that and keep inserting breakpoints, dramatic cuts to black, cliffhangers, moments of peril, and moments of suspense to engineer a good moment to kick the player back out to the world map to play 10 or 15 games to unlock the next cutscene. And what that means is that by the third region, the action feels profoundly stale, because you already know how the region is going to play out. You're going to arrive, you're going to get 5 or 6 instances of peril and cliffhangers, you're going to fail to acquire a piece of Isolde's soul, and you're going to go home with a new Sentinel who's going to give you new missions to play. The tension curve of the story starts repeating over and over and over again, and it becomes monotonous and structurally really unexciting. And all of this, remember, all of these constraints and limitations, all of this constant prompting of the player to grind more games, that's not something the writers came up with. That demand comes 110% from above, from management, from the executives looking at their data graphs who want the line to go up, demanding that the number one priority of the visual novel is to generate engagement. The number one priority of the narrative thus becomes to make players play more games and play more games for longer, rather than, telling a good and engaging goddamn story. If you want a picture of just how blatantly grind was built into the visual novel, by week 3, Riot had to implement a repeatable mission that would grant you 600 points of progress in order to give a lot of players anything like a reasonable chance of making it through the visual novel at all. Now, bear in mind, most missions in the novel would grant you 40 to 50 points per completion at most at the very end of the game, so a 600 point repeatable bonus just for completing a PvP game is incredibly telling of just how much f***ing grinding Riot was expecting to extract from its players with this event. Riot expected the average player to grind that many points on their own, and when it turns out that players weren't actually interested in doing that, they had to artificially pump the numbers just to keep people playing. The visual novel was designed not to tell a good story, not to deliver a satisfying narrative, not to expand the realm of what storytelling is possible in PC League of Legends. It was designed to make you grind. Telling a good story in between all that grind, that's the writer's problem. Let the artists figure that one out. Management just wants the line to go up. Another problem is that the story that the event is telling just isn't very well suited to the visual novel that they made. Now, I said before that a visual novel with enough time and budget can tell any story about any subject in any genre, and that's true, but the caveat there is with enough time and budget. A visual novel absolutely can tell the story of a team of fantasy heroes waging epic battles against the armies of the dead led by a ghostly despot king, but the Sentinels of Light visual novel can't. Let me give you an example. On Targon, Pantheon summons an army of the dead that the Sentinels have to battle in an epic battle scene. And the grand total of this battle scene, in terms of how it plays out in the game, is some text boxes and some flashing effects on the screen. Pantheon, the aspect of war, is defeated and undone by a text box that says the Sentinels shoot him real hard until he falls over. Like, the writer does their best to describe the battle scene in an engaging way, but the whole thing just feels really inert and boring and half-baked. The narrative is trying to depict this epic fantasy magic gunfight, but the assets that it has available to depict that gunfight through just can't pull it off. Visual novels can tell this kind of story. You can insert splash illustrations, limited animation cutscenes, slideshows. There are all kinds of ways to tell the story of an epic battle in a compelling way within the format. The Phoenix Wright visual novels, for example, usually open a case with a much more elaborately produced cutscene showing the murder you're about to investigate with custom splash screens and animation. Really, all the Sentinels of Light event would have needed would be some nice, well-drawn splash screens with comic-style illustrations showing the action, but the Sentinels of Light visual novel just doesn't have the assets. All they have is flashes on screen and character sprites with a few expressions, and I know independent visual novels on Steam that do more than that to sell their big moments in the narrative. From a company that boasts 100 million monthly players, $1.5 billion in annual revenue, and the backing of Tencent, that's not good enough. Where was the budget for this visual novel, Riot? Where was the production time necessary to make a good product? If COVID fucked up your schedule, why didn't you delay it? Again, I'm not suggesting any of this is easy or a simple thing to do, but Riot has the resources to make a much better visual novel than this, if it had wanted to. And I'm not saying adding more assets to the visual novel would just magically have made all the writing get better, but, like, at least the production values wouldn't have felt so embarrassingly cheap. But the answer why they didn't do that is perhaps obvious, because we've covered it already. From the perspective of Riot's management, the function of the visual novel was to make players grind normal games. And clearly, they decided that it doesn't need production values to do that. The irony, though, is that if the production values had been better, if there had been reasons to get excited to see what happens next, like, oh my god, what kind of cutscene is going to play out in this next chapter, players would probably have been happier to grind for it. Anyway, the grind-based structure of the visual novel, besides just being kind of awful and exploitative, also made another issue worse. So, if you're playing a game and an NPC gives you a fetch quest, like, go here, pick up that thing, bring it back, that's a fairly low-effort quest. You probably don't expect to be granted any ancient, all-powerful relics for completing that one. Similarly, if you go into a dungeon with 15 puzzles, 6 bosses, and 5 hours worth of exploration and environmental hazards to play around, you expect at the end of all of that the game will give you a big, fat, juicy reward for your time. In the Sentinels of Light visual novel, the story scenes are the quest reward. You grind out missions to earn points to unlock story, and so the same logic should apply. The value and importance of a given story scene should be reflected in the amount of effort it took to unlock it. Right? Well, wrong, actually. The amount of points required to unlock things scales linearly, week to week, and there is absolutely no difference between the amount of grind it takes to unlock the story of Miss Fortune's tragic fall to Ruination, and the amount of grind it takes to unlock Scooby-Doo heist hijinks with Graves in Piltover and so on. Thus, structurally, the game design insists that 20 minutes of Olaf and Vex having a comedy snowball fight in the Freljord is of equal weight and importance to karma getting ruined and the spirit of Ionia itself getting corrupted by the power of the undead. And that quickly gets pretty damn frustrating. The grind-based structure of the visual novel requires that the comedy interlude with Olaf and Vex in the Freljord takes up just as much time and space in the story, an entire chapter, as Viego corrupting the peak of Montargon and reviving and ruining the spirit of Pantheon. Those two events are given equal weight in the narrative, and it leads to massive, overwhelming tone problems. See, because there's nothing wrong with Olaf and Vex having a comedy snowball fight in the Freljord. There's nothing wrong with humorous interludes and comic relief. All stories kinda need them, I think. But Sentinels of Light is about the Ruination. It's about this apocalyptic, world-destroying threat that Viego represents. It's about armies of undead sweeping across Runeterra, killing everything in their wake, and champions being torn apart and turned into puppets by their own darkest emotions and fear. So an entire fifth of that story probably shouldn't be dedicated to light-hearted comedy fun times, especially when the writing absolutely insists on shoving light-hearted comedy fun times and comic relief into the serious chapters as well, besides also giving you the option to talk like a shitposting 2008 Tumblr user in every dialogue option. Sentinels of Light has catastrophic tone problems, and the structure of the story is a big reason why. Rengar, Pike, Graves, and Olaf are entirely comic relief characters, which is theoretically fine, but when the structure of the story demands that entire chapters are dedicated entirely to these comedy goofballs, that comes at the cost of the actually important characters with serious story arcs like Senna, Lucian, Irelia, Shyvana, Gwen, and Yorick Mori. And put a pin in that, because we'll come back to the question of just how important these characters are to the story later, but one of the big complaints that everybody, including me, had about the visual novel from the first minute was that it featured absolutely no appearances from most of the characters who are traditionally tied to the Ruined King. No Yorick until the very last minute, and then he only appears for 5 seconds to sprinkle water on you before you're f***ed off. No Callista, even though she's the one who led Viego to the Blessed Isles. No Maokai, even though he's the spirit of the islands that Viego ruined. No Hecarim, even though he was Viego's most loyal and violent servant. No Karthus to sing the dirges of a world enveloped in death. And no intervention from Tarek, the ostensible protector of the world. No appearances from LeBlanc and the Black Rose, who might have some understandable interest in an undead apocalypse sweeping over the world. No Twisted Fate, even though Graves is there. No Gangplank, even though Misfortune won't shut up about him. No Ilaoi, Yasuo, Ari, or Braum, even though they are in the Ruined King game. No Jarvan trying to save Shyvana. No Darius trying to beat some sense into his brother. No Swain, who you might think had seen this coming. No Shen and the Kinku trying to restore balance to Ionia. Not even an appearance from the Kindred, who govern death and life when Akshan resurrects their prey. And I fully accept that the visual novel was never going to include everyone. Even for a turbo-rich company like Riot, that would explode the scope out of all proportion, and it would lead to a worse narrative. There were always going to be cuts. There's always going to be a bunch of characters who you just kind of have to accept are off somewhere else fighting the undead on their own. That's fine. That's completely reasonable. But it becomes a really tough pill to swallow that there couldn't possibly be time to include Yorick more in the story, when the visual novel apparently has no problem dedicating entire chapters to Olaf and Rengar shouting about themselves in third person while getting their asses handed to them by ghosts. You couldn't cut a few minutes of chasing Graves through the sewers of Piltover and Zaun in order to give Yorick more than 10 spoken lines. It was that important that we hear Rengar brag about his big sharp kitty cat claws. Because of that rigid chapter-based structure that was needed to enforce the grind, you have to spend a huge amount of time engaged with story content that just doesn't feel that important or impactful. And certainly my reaction to being forced to sit through something that feels so unimportant was to think, hey, I wonder what Yorick is doing right now. I wonder if Callista is doing anything important while Viego is walking the world again. Gee, sure would be nice to know what Maokai is doing. Because all of those plot threads seem more engaging and interesting than watching Graves run around being an idiot in the Undercity of Zaun with a soul fetter. Yeah. The structure is a big part of the reason why the visual novel can't seem to decide if it's a comedy heist adventure or a disaster movie race against time to save the world from horrifying devastation. It kills the flexibility that writers need in order to craft a good story, and it makes every other niggle and nitpick and issue in the lore feel worse and more egregious. When Riot found, to their horror, that players weren't willing to put in the 600 points worth of grind a day that they were expecting them to, this is part of the reason why. The quest rewards didn't match the amount of time and effort you were being asked to spend to unlock them. Anyway, remember how Riot made like 4 dedicated champions and 14 canon skins entirely for this event? We talked about how Riot experimented with Senna to find out if we would get excited for champions that are drawn directly from the lore or directly connected to a storyline. And when they found that the answer was yes, they produced Yone for Spirit Blossom, and Viego, Gwen, Vex, and Akshan for the Ruined King event. The selling point of these champions, of Gwen, the living doll infused with the soul of Isolde, Akshan, the rogue sentinel who can bring people back from the dead, and Vex, the gloomy yordle who hates light and fun, is that these characters would be integral to the story, that the story of the Ruined King could not be told without these very important key players to drive the narrative forward. Get excited for these champions, lore fans, because they're going to be a big deal. They're going to be so important. You're not going to be able to even imagine how the Ruined King story plays out without these important characters. Unless you play Wild Rift, in which case it turns out, oh no, wait, we didn't need them at all. Wild Rift, besides having the better implementation of a visual novel, also tells a complete version of the Ruined King story through its comic, steadfast heart. It including Riven, Irelia, Vayne, and Akshan. It includes Lucian and Senna's difficulty repairing the relationship, and it features the final defeat of the Ruined King, with Viego sealed in Camavor to be a recurring threat some other time. Guess what it doesn't feature, though? Vex and Gwen. Also no Pike, Rengar, Graves, Diana, and a bunch of other characters, because it turns out they weren't actually necessary to the plot. And the reason why is pretty simple. In every version of the story, on PC or on Wild Rift, the only actually important characters to the narrative of the Sentinels of Light event are Viego, Isolde, Senna, and Lucian. The theme of the story is love, and what it means to love someone. Viego is obsessed and entitled, determined to force Isolde back to life no matter if she wants to or not, because he loves her, and love is the most important thing of all, don't you know? Lucian, meanwhile, is equally desperate not to lose Senna again, and he struggles terribly to respect her independence and agency, to respect her wishes and let her go, because his love keeps compelling him to try and get in the way and protect her. In this way, Viego and Lucian are mirror opposites of each other, as are Senna and Isolde, and the contrast between their relationships forms the core of the story. The trouble is, nobody else's story is actually important to the plot of the game as a whole. Even if we focus only on the most prominent characters like Gwen, Vex, and Akshan, champions created specifically for the event, what the Wild Rift comic demonstrates is that none of them are necessary at all for the story's themes to resolve, much less other secondary characters like Pike, Olaf, Rengar, or Diana. Because the core of the story is so tightly bound only to Lucian, Senna, Isolde, and Viego, everyone else ends up entirely optional at best, and completely irrelevant at worst. Which sucks a lot, because Gwen, Vex, and Akshan were created for the event. They were made to be part of this story. It's how they were sold to us as players and customers. It's how they were justified in the lore of Runeterra. You should care about Gwen and her plot, Riot said, because she's integral to the plot of the Ruined King storyline. You should care about Akshan because he's going to play an important role in the event. And Vex, oh, you can't have the Ruination without Vex. Akshan especially was so heavily sold as another thematic opposite to Viego, another man obsessed with reviving a dead woman who through the Ruination event learns to let go of that desire and let the dead rest. Wow, that sure seems like a cool angle to explore, some rich thematic ground to tread. And then they don't. He has no dynamic with Viego, no relationship. They don't ever reflect on each other or clash in any meaningful way. They never really even exchange words beyond a few one-liners. They're not part of each other's stories. Akshan shows up at the end to do the ironic killing Isolde to revive Gwen and Senna play, which admittedly is a clever use of his gimmick, but beyond that, in the story, he's just yet another quip-spewing joke machine. He's used as a prop, valuable only for the magic gun he holds. He's not used as an actual character. And again, there's something really bitter about seeing Riot invent an entirely new character to be a thematic nemesis to Viego, and then fail to do anything with that, when Yorick is right there. Viego is the Ruined King who uses the dead like tools and things. Yorick is the humble gravedigger who speaks with the dead and care for them. Viego is obsessed with dragging his wife out of death whether she wants it or not. Yorick's moral mission is to grant the dead the peace of rest. There was already a strong thematic opposite to Viego in the lore, a man who lives on the Shadow Isles and has since before Viego ruined them, a man whose story for 7 years has promised a confrontation with the ruined king, which Riot decided to deny us in favor of inventing a new nemesis who only exists to pull the trigger on a magic gun that resolves the plot. It is at the very least a breach of trust to tell your audience to their faces that these characters are going to be important and then fail to make them matter. And this applies, of course, in equal measure to the skins. And here, again, I am not unsympathetic to the practicalities of the situation. Riot is a business, they need to make money, yada yada, they need to at least recoup the costs of developing the event and all of the art and marketing and R&D time and quality assurance and translation and implementation and all the other behind-the-scenes stuff that goes into it. So okay, there was always going to be some business bias in who gets to have Sentinel skins. That's completely fine, honestly. But again, asking your audience to pay money for these things with the promise that these skins are canon lore, that these characters are important in the story, and then to sit here and see them be rendered irrelevant comic relief, see them be left out of the animated shorts and shoved to the side in the visual novel, it's a breach of trust. It's a shitty thing to do to your audience. Because those Sentinel skin choices could have worked. In fact, I thought they were going to work, because what I thought you were doing was, we have this structure of going to a region, chasing down a fetter, losing it to Viego, but gaining a recruit, right? These recruits are awkward. They're a bunch of misfits from vastly different backgrounds with vastly different abilities. This one is a big game hunter. That one is a robber and a con artist. This one's a monster hunter. That one is a literal moon god. So what that says to me is, we're building a heist movie team. We're doing a Dirty Dozen. We're running a classic Avengers or Guardians of the Galaxy gambit. They're going to start out as this miscoordinated mess of people working at cross purposes, but by the end, they'll all come together as a team, and each of them will contribute some unique part of their skill set, and everyone turns out to be key to winning the final battle. Like, Rengar will track Viego with his hunting skills, and Pike will scout the enemy with his stealth, and Graves will con Viego with bravado, and Diana uses moon magic to trap him, and Olaf is the muscle, and Vayne does monster hunter. Like, it was supposed to be this big coming together of all these disparate, strange characters into one cohesive whole, which provides a sort of thematic counterpart to Viego, who's so narcissistic and like, I shall do everything on my own because I am the only person who matters, right? And there are gestures towards that in the story. During the battle with Pantheon and Mount Targon, for example, Irelia and Riven are the ones who figure out how to break through his undead phalanx of soldiers, drawing on their experience with the Noxus Ionia War. And that kind of works. And there are hints here and there that the idea was that everyone should be important. But even in the PC visual novel, when it comes time for the final battle, the caption literally just says that everyone does some fighting, and then Viego drags Senna and Gwen through a portal, and the actual battle is won by Akshan sneaking in and firing the gun that resolves the plot. So Vayne, and Graves, and Pantheon, and Misfortune, and Shyvana, and Rengar, and Irelia, and Riven, and Draven, and Karma, and Pike, and Olaf, and Diana, and Gwen, and Vex don't really exist as players in the plot. They are not inseparable building blocks of the narrative. They're just set dressing. They're props. They are extras. Insofar as any of them have character arcs, those character arcs have no impact on the main story. Like, Diana regains her resolve to save Targon, and Irelia and Riven forge an uneasy friendship, but those things don't come into play at all in the story of the visual novel. They're just things that happen in the background, and if you took them out, nothing material would change about the actual plot. They have no effect, they have no impact. Now, there could be a lot of reasons things turned out this way. Maybe it was intentional on the part of the writers to focus very hard on a central storyline. Wild Rift didn't have all the characters of the PC version, so maybe it was a decision to tell a story that could be told across both platforms. Which, okay, fine, but it had this side effect of rendering most of the characters completely irrelevant. It was a bad decision. Given the state of the visual novel, though, the lack of development, the lack of clear budget, I am more inclined to believe that the core story around Lucian, Senna, Viego, and Isolde is all that the developers were given proper time and resources to actually develop. I think everything else was considered extra and thus expendable when it came to assigning development time. From management's perspective, you don't need compelling secondary characters to make players grind those missions, after all. Before we get to the conclusion, I wanted to have a brief section to be positive. Yes, there's a lot wrong with the Sentinels of Light event, and I think it's justified to let the problems overshadow the accomplishments, but it's not as though it didn't do anything right. So here's a few nice things about the Sentinels of Light event that I think are good, actually, and which I want to give the writers and artists props for coming up with. First of all, the background art and character sprites, absolutely excellent. Like, a bunch of the background is edited copies of concept art that already existed on Universe, but the original pieces are really good. Like, I love the serene, high-contrast black against white vibes of the Sentinel weapons room, for example. I love the use of light here. The corrupted Ishtal ruins look really cool, and the colorful, flowery meadow of Camivore is a really nice touch, both to contrast it with the Shadow Isles, but also to give it this sort of romantic, dreamlike quality that works really well as a backdrop to those final scenes. The character sprites are universally pretty great too. Like, you have this graphic kind of Hades-like style of highly saturated, colorful sprites with pitch black shadows and surreal neon edge lighting that really makes them pop. I especially want to call out Ruined Dragon Shyvana, Sentinel Graves, Sentinel Olaf, and Senna as just great character sprites, just really nice character illustrations. Besides that, there are also some good story decisions. As I mentioned in the What's the Deal with Shyvana video, I think having Shyvana get ruined is a good decision, and one that should, Riot, push her story forward, Riot. You should use the Ruination to push Shyvana's story forward, Riot, because I think it was a good move. Similarly, I really like the enemies to friends dynamic of Irelia and Riven. I really like that these two characters get to develop a dynamic that interacts with their histories. That rules. We get to see just how angry Irelia is about the Noxian invasion and just how bitter Riven is about having been a part of it. And that's really cool. Keep going with that. I do also like the idea of Sentinel Vayne. Like, last time we saw her, she was an unrepentant serial killer who literally murdered her best friend and mentor and mother figure at the drop of a hat and felt happy about it, so it's a little sudden that she's apparently now mellowed out and okay with Senna being half undead, but having Vayne join the Sentinels is a good move forward for her. I wish you'd done some work beforehand to show us how Vayne got to be chill enough not to murder Senna on sight, but, you know, I take what I can get. And I also think that having Graves be her big, dumb, idiot himbo friend who refuses to let her push him away is a good character dynamic. Like, it's good fun. Most of all, though, I think Lucian and Senna's story is good. I think Viego and Isolde's story is good. I think contrasting their relationships is good. That core narrative I've been talking about of Lucian struggling to let go of his wife for fear of losing her, played against Viego's apocalyptic narcissism in refusing to let his wife go, that's really strong. There's a good, mature, interesting story going on between Lucian and Senna, something which is emotionally more complicated than you would expect from a fantasy video game story like this, and it's explored pretty well, honestly, in the visual novel, and really well in the Wild Rift comic. For all that I complain about pretty much every single aspect around the core story being weak, the core story itself is really strong, and I really like it. I think they did a good job with it. So, we've gone through my analysis and my opinions on a lot of what went wrong in the Sentinels of Light. I have tried to focus in my analysis on bigger factors and structural problems hampering the event, rather than zeroing in on individual decisions. So to recap, the primary reason the Sentinels of Light went wrong isn't that this or that writer is bad, or that such and such champion didn't get a Sentinel skin. It wasn't even because they left out Yorick, even though, yes, that's absolutely bullshit. Hey! I believe it happened, first and foremost, because the writers, artists, and designers weren't given the time, the resources, or the freedom to make a better product. In the face of a global pandemic and a catastrophically delayed prequel game, the decision was made to ship the product on time anyway in order to maximize the grind and make the line go up, and the result was a weak, poorly put together, shoddy product infected with exploitative grinding incentives, delivering a deeply unsatisfying narrative and utterly betraying the trust of the players who had been excited for it. Riot is fond of wheeling out their rank-and-file employees on social media to act as spokespeople for the company. They are fond of letting their employees take the heat when the community gets heated, while the executives and leadership who actually control the company's decisions and who should be held accountable for them are happy to skulk around in the background. But the leadership are the people responsible for the product. That is their job, to be the place where the buck stops. And I lay this failure first and foremost at their feet. They are not responsible for the writing of the visual novel, but they are responsible for the conditions that led to the writing in the visual novel. Okay, that's the video. That is my analysis of why the Sentinels of Light is bad. I tried to shy away from blaming individual plot holes or complaining about writing decisions, and I hope you found something useful in my analysis. Having said that, though, I do want to rant about the plot holes. I tried to stay sober and calm this whole time, but I am tired of being nice, and I want to go apeshit. So, this video will have a part 2, without much editing, without much polish, where I get to voice my complaints. I'm not sure if I recommend that you watch it, because it's going to be a lot of negativity, but if you too need catharsis, hey, come along for the ride, I guess. Thank you to the sponsor of this video, Skillshare, whose sponsorship helps me pay the rent this month. Skillshare is a learning platform, so it has no ads, and if you'd like to improve or learn some new skills of your own, the first 1,000 of my subscribers who click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of premium membership so you can explore your own creativity. And since this video talked a lot about writing, why not explore some of their classes on creative writing yourself? There's everything from guides on essay writing, which is sort of what I do in these videos, to advice for starting and structuring novels. For example, writer, activist, and Professor Roxanne Gay has a class on writing personal essays, going over every phase of the process, from research to revision to rejections and getting published. Thank you again to Skillshare for their support of this channel. Hey, thank you very much for watching. I trashed a lot of drafts of the script for this video because they just kept getting longer and longer and longer, and eventually I had to cut it down. I know that there's more to cover and way more to talk about. I didn't touch on the animated shorts, for example, but at some point I had to stop writing the damn script and actually finish the damn video. Anyway, if you've enjoyed it, I would certainly appreciate it if you would take the time to hit the like button, and if you want more videos sort of like this, you can subscribe and maybe leave a comment to let YouTube know that you have engaged with my content. Yeah, I know, it's ironic. For all that I've criticized Riot for prioritizing engagement, I also kind of have to do that myself because it's part of my job. Capitalism. I'll skip plugging my Patreon and stuff since this video is sponsored, but I will tell you that I have a shorts channel where I make short videos about things. I am doing quick analyses of Gen 1 Pokemon right now, and Dark Souls bosses, and reviewing skins. And I also have a Let's Play channel where I just play video games instead of complaining about them. Currently over there, I'm going through Skyward Sword, The Great Ace Attorney, I'm playing Final Fantasy XIV, and I'm starting a Pokemon Nuzlocke challenge soon. So, you know, quite a lot of content over there if you want it. So, thanks again for watching. Remember to wear a mask and wash your hands, yes, even still, and take whatever vaccines we're going to need to make this all blow over. And try to act with solidarity towards those who are worse off than yourself.